A pleasure to meet all at last. And so, even though I have my last few episodes of films I should have talked about years ago left ready to go by this point, I just want to take a bit of time to conjure up a few unique ideas for some bonus material, since unfortunately there hasn't been very much in terms of theatrical releases or releases concerning anything coming from different platforms. And on top of all that, there has been a good handful of things from mid to late 2025 that I have missed out on. So, you know what though? I feel like we'll bend the rules a bit in terms of what bonus episodes for the Talk About Universe will entail to. And so, 2 more pieces for late 2025 will in fact be the main focus of these 2 bonus episodes I plan on making. So, right before I get on to episode number 220 of films I should have talked about years ago, we're going to focus on something for number 219.5. And for this instance, I'd like to talk a bit about Tron Ares. Yeah, so a bit late to that sort of department, but the thing is that this is another film in the Tron series, and considering the fact that I had already gone ahead and reviewed Tron Legacy for pretty much the first time, I feel like it was only fair that I would eventually have to cover the other Tron films. Now, I ultimately can't say very much about the first Tron film from 1982, although it was of course famous for having starred the likes of Jeff Bridges. But, believe it or not, even though Tron Legacy didn't have very much to do with what Jeff Bridges had, in spite of his showcasing as merely a small appearance, much like with Daft Punk's appearance in Tron's Legacy alongside the composure of which, for Tron Ares, it's a bit of a different story. The composition / soundtrack of the film was made possible by 9 Inch Nails, primarily for the likes of Trent Reznor, same guy whom had also done composition work for the likes of mid-90s, as an example. It's something I hadn't really pointed out when I made my video of it, as some people have mentioned in the comment section, so thank goodness I was able to put that into account. Kind of unique that Trent Reznor even comes into play here, but in any case though, some of the main productive team that comes into play for this film includes the likes of, believe it or not, Jared Leto. He also is a member of the cast here. The director was done by Joaquin Roning. Now, Roning, of course, has had his own run in terms of filmmaking, as he was responsible for the production of the more recent Pirates of the Caribbean films, including 2017's Dead Men Tell No Tales. And there is, of course, talks about his productions of the upcoming Pirates of the Caribbean Part 6. And then, of course, we could also recognize Joaquin Roning for the likes of other films. The sequel to 2014's Maleficent, Bandidas, and even a movie based on the Beatles from 2014. So, you could say that his work is pretty notable, much like when we saw how Mark Forster had done over the years. There were plans of him creating a Thomas and Friends movie, especially after success with films like World War Z, but you can say it didn't necessarily go too well. Well, in any case though, Tron Ares, once again, is a bit of a leap into the future, a few years after which. But what we have here is the likes of a whole new cast. First off, with Eve Kim mainly being the ones behind the lights of certain things that take place, as well as the likes of Ares himself. Yeah, essentially a fabrication / AI creation of the likes of a way to bring a piece of the grid into the world. Now, if you hadn't already heard, Tron is seen as an exploration of a supposed digital world called the grid. The grid itself was put together many years ago and was seen as a unique escape from real-life Earth. However, not too many people seem to go there, and it's mostly because only the few that do so realize just how dangerous of a world it is compared to real life. As I have discussed in my video about Tron Legacy though, which came out 15 years prior, it's worthy to note that the grid in that instance did allow for one young man to unfortunately end up in a predicament with the law, and even after being released, he happens to find his way into the grid and eventually trying to find his way back out. Well, the grid in this instance goes on a slightly different tangent. Because you see, Eve Kim is unfortunately a target whom is to be held by members of the grid, including Ares himself. And the reason being is because she happens to stumble upon a few secrets that the company that is responsible for maintaining the grid, as well as for bringing these clones from the grid to life on Earth. There was one drawback to this sort of phenomenon. Only 30 minutes can last until these clones will break down. And that is one of the main gripes that the company seems to have. However, with Eve Kim as well as her own team, they happen to discover a supposed solution to all this. A way for everything to go without breaking down. In fact, they actually put together a test that allows for a fruit tree to remain up pretty much forever. So, essentially, they figured out the secret. And this secret, unfortunately, seems to be a bit of a competition to the likes of the company itself. Now, the company, unfortunately, just doesn't want these secrets getting out. So as crappy as the idea itself sounds, with the storyboard itself giving us the idea that Eve Kim is now seen as a target for termination, as if we haven't heard of that before, have we? Well, in any case though, the whole rest of the film centers on Kim trying to evade from the likes of the grid itself, as well as the company that's being operated by none other than, wouldn't you know, the successors of various other people. Essentially the Dillinger family and Dillinger Incorporated itself. The company itself that is after Eve Kim, especially with its main head of the company, Julian Dillinger, not to mention his mother Elizabeth, who sees him as a successor. The thing is that with these clones that can only last for 30 minutes before disintegrating, and this secret that gets out to allow for them to become permanent, living life forms on Earth, and not just some pieces of organic material that breaks down over time through digitalization. Of course, there was going to be a supposed plot point that would allow for them to want to chase after Eve Kim in the first place. But in a shocking turn of events, despite seeing Eva being brought into the grid thanks to a teleporting ray from a helicopter, well, Ares eventually starts to look over the idea that Eve is now somebody that he wants to protect. And don't get me wrong, Jared Leto, he's had some pretty tough times on film over the years, and some might look at him as an actor who's really trying his best here. It was kind of one thing where he played that atrocious Joker from the DCEU, and then he came along in 2022's Morbius, which was something else I had talked about just as well. And now that we have a Tron sequel, although it's kind of more like a reboot in a way, but it does seemingly take place many years after the events of the last film. So let's just put it this way. We have Jared Leto in a film in which that unfortunately does suffer from some not so good storyline readouts as well as screenplays. And at the same time, you have yourself the likes of a certain plot point that a secret that could unfortunately cause the company to crumble, as Dillinger is basically more reliant on the usage of these clones and having the 30-minute time wait in effect. Well, it really does create a bit of a blood-boiling time, which unfortunately seems to last for the rest of the whole film. There aren't too many things that are redeeming about it, nor would you consider it to be in any ways better than what you might think of from the last two films. Though I will say it does excel in a number of ways. There's a lot of unique acting and dialogue that takes place, and I also do appreciate the fighting choreography that goes here, especially with Ares himself really kicking it into high gear. And this is somebody whom, keep in mind, despite Eva Kim being trapped and cornered by various characters that are sent after her, including a recurring character played by Jodie Turner-Smith. She is, of course, seen as the assassin by Julian and is sent after Eva multiple times, not just in the grid, but even outside the grid when she's generated into a real-life clone. So, of course, the time limit is on her just as well. But there even comes a point in which that, despite Eva getting back to her own company building, Ares unfortunately gets zapped. A certain weapon unfortunately causes a near-permanent discharge, pretty much eliminating Ares. Shockingly though, he actually is still alive. But he has seemingly been transported to a certain part of the grid that's relatively unexplored. But remember when I mentioned Jeff Bridges? Well, he, believe it or not, is back yet again. And he seemingly found his place within the grid itself. So I guess you can say that the films really evolved since day one, back in 1982. And on top of all that, I feel like that Jeff Bridges, while he's certainly in no ways like how he was before then, he at least does his part to convince Ares to not only get back up there, but to also offer him the choice. The choice in which that he can essentially be allowed to have a permanent life. And well, it does seem that's what he chooses. So Ares not only gets back on Earth, but he goes up to once again protect against the likes of Dillinger's forces. Because a massive gunship comes in the area. And you know, it kind of reminds me of Pixels, the way that those giant pixelized spacecrafts were hovering over the buildings in the city. We have a similar thing going on here with the likes of Jodie Turner-Smith going against the likes of everything in her path. All these buildings, all these cars, all these everything. It's just nuts. All that just because Eva Kim did something? Wow. Way to go, Dillinger. But you know what, though? Ares is able to turn the tide, thankfully, and even eliminate the assassin. When she breaks down, it's pretty much over for Julius. His mother, of course, was killed earlier in the film, and he's pretty much the only man alone in the entire building. Law enforcement agencies start to come after him as they've realized that the company was responsible for sending out these crazy weapons from the grid. And the unfortunate thing, though, is that even when they manage to get into the building by breaching through the door, Julian manages to make his escape. Yeah, teleports himself straight to the grid instead of surrendering. I sense a part 4 in the future. Well, until all that happens, though, we do have at least a few things that are quite satisfying, though. Just the fact that there was a big part of destruction that takes place, and just the fact that there is Eva Kim and Ares, who now are on Earth, thankfully for good. Yeah, even Ares now has a permanent life. A life in which that he can basically live like a person. And we do get a bit of an epilogue that shows them both in different outfits, showing that Ares doesn't have to be in his grid uniform any longer, provided that he does try to live a good life. It does seem that with this film, they at least did a really good job at giving us another reason to ever revisit the grid, much less with the likes of creating a new storyline that can at least have significance with it. On top of having Jeff Bridges from the original come back, I'd say this is a lot more notable, and I will probably go so far to say this might deserve a lot bigger of a score than you might expect. It might have average scorings on the likes of IMDb and other sources, but for us at Kaiju Force Neo, 7.4 out of 10.1. Pretty much still within our own average zone here because we do consider 7.0 to be the standard, and any good thing or bad thing will of course shift the score around. And it's pretty much true that the likes of not so well written storylines is one of the most notorious things about the Tron films. Ares, unfortunately, was not an exception to all this. But I will say that some of the acting, fighting choreography, soundtracks, especially with the likes of Trent Reznor doing it all, yeah, you can pretty much rely on him, especially anybody of Nine Inch Nails for the soundtracks. But that's mostly because of Daft Punk's departure back in March 2021, just a few years ago. So I'm sure they would have done their best to make compositions of this on their own, but either way you look at it though, with most of the other elements that I've already discussed here, as well as when I talked about Tron Legacy, it was at least good to revisit the grid for the first time in 15 years. But I'm sure given another 15 years, there might be another film on the way. So who really knows? Anyways though, I will be talking about 3 more films, probably a big trilogy, worth talking about here. And I will have another bonus feature coming pretty soon. So make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side for more.